We're ready to go again now. So as I was saying, this is the fourth Sunday in January 2016. This is the 25th year at least, maybe more, that I've been going through the first four chapters of the Introduction to the Science of Mind text by Ernest Holmes. And every year something different comes out for me. Something fresh is there. It's sometimes I pick up the same book that I know that I've read many times, and I read a page and it's like, why did I never see that before? And what that means is that our consciousness evolves, our consciousness grows, and it changes, and we look at the same things, but we see them in a new way, and in a fresh way, and in a different way. So when we started this month of January, we talked about kind of checking in, kind of re-examining where we are in our understanding and in our beliefs, and asking ourselves, well, where am I now compared to where I was a year ago? And where am I now compared to where I see myself in a year from now? Consciousness is unfolding. You and I are individualized centers of consciousness that is unfolding and expanding. And we can choose to cooperate in that process or not. Now, it's inevitable that eventually we will all expand and unfold. But we can seem to cause a delay. I mean, we can seem to stay in the same place or stay stuck for a while. But eventually we move. And sometimes we move in spurts. Sometimes we go up to a plateau and we stay there for a while. And we may even move backwards a little bit. We may forget some of the things that we knew. But eventually we move up again, and we move up again, and we move up again. So the important thing I would hope that everyone considers is that what our lives are about, the most important thing that our lives are about, is this unfoldment of the soul, this discovery of the soul. And it's said many different ways in many different teachings. I was reading one this morning that was talking about to realize the imbuement of the divinity, that we are just, it is in us, it is as us, it is through us. In the New Testament, Paul said, have the same mind that was in Christ Jesus. Discover the presence of the divine within. Discover it, but more than just at an intellectual level. Realize it. Realize it through experience. Realize it as a very integral part of your life, as the very essence of what you think you are, that which animates you, that which is your soul. And what our lives are about then is that we are constantly discovering more and more, more and more of what that divine nature is. And that requires conscious cooperation. So where were we a year ago? Where do we want to be a year from now? And are we going to use the tools and the knowledge that we have, that has been handed down to us, so that we may deliberately continue in an upward spiral in the growth of our own soul? It's very important that we consider this, right? Because many of us grew up in teachings that told us, well, all you have to kind of do is get through this life, and then after you die, then something happens after you die, and then you get to go to heaven. And what we're saying is, life is a matter of consciousness. What we're saying here is life is an unfoldment of consciousness. And you are no more a spiritual being now than you will be a spiritual being after you die. And wherever you find yourself in this grand scheme of eternity, wherever you find yourself, you will always be consciousness unfolding. Always be consciousness unfolding. We are never going to know all that the divine is. We are never going to experience all that the divine is. But we are always going to be discovering more of what the divine is, more of what the divine as us is. So for that reason, we say, let's get busy now. Let's get started now. Let's not wait until death comes to say, oh, well, now's the time to get spiritual. But let's recognize our spiritual nature right here and right now. Let's recognize that this world about us, while it appears solid and form, it is spirit. Spirit appearing as matter, right? This is the invisible becoming visible. And the invisible becomes visible under the direction of thought, of the law of mind. Spirit says, let there be planets, and planets appear. They evolve. The invisible energy of the universe comes into form as gases and clouds in the universe. And stars form, and planets form. And there's an orderly process by which this unfolds. But nevertheless, we have to say what got it all started. What is the creative cause of the universe? And the creative cause, the creative energy in the universe is thought. Represented to us in scriptures of many worlds as the thought of God. And represented to us in many teachings, from spiritual teachings to psychology and self-help teachings, as being the creative process in our own lives. What the mind can conceive and can believe, the mind can achieve. The Stoic philosophers gave us that, and many of the psychology and self-help books in the 60s and the 70s repeated it. Make up your mind and keep it changed, and all of these things. So that's kind of the essence of what Dr. Holmes gave us in the Science of Mind teaching. Remember, he said it's not a special revelation to him, but it's the culmination of all revelations. That we live in a spiritual universe, that we are spiritual things, spiritual creations, that the activity of spirit is thought, and something responds to that thought and arranges the circumstances and the matter and all of those other things that appear. Arranges them to be the perfect outpicturing of that mental equivalent that we have provided to the law of mind. It's as simple as that. Now, let's talk a little bit about Ernest, and we'll talk a little bit about why it's important that we put this to the test, that we try it for ourselves. Right? We can't just take Ernest Holmes' word for it. We just can't take anyone's word for it. We won't know if it's so if we don't test it ourselves. Right? I believe it's the Gospel of John says, test the spirits to see if they be true spirits. Emerson said, don't take somebody else's word for what's good, but find out for yourself what is good and what is not good. So Ernest Holmes, from the biographies that we have about him and from the memories of the people who knew him, some of the folks on the call used to go to a Silmar when we would go out to California. And they used to have every year, they would have, Dr. J. Scott Neal would have a little table set up, and it was kind of like the history of religious science. And he would have some old artifacts, some old books, and he would stand there and he would tell stories about the old days. And then they would have breakout sessions. I remember we went to one, and Carlton Whitehead was there, and I think Barbara Lundy was there. and they were talking about their memories of Ernest Holmes. And from everything that we get from what people were telling us, Dr. Bill Hornaday, who was co-pastor with Ernest, he gave several talks that I've seen on tape about kind of life with Ernest. And of course, Fenwick Holmes wrote a very loving biography about his brother. But he was seemed to be a very kind of jovial man, a fun-filled man. He seemed to really enjoy life and to have fun with life. And one of the things that he told us was, let's not be superstitious about this inquiry into life itself. Let's not be superstitious about what God might be. And that's a big break. See, that's a big break from many traditional religions. In our country, back in the mid-1700s, they had a great spiritual awakening, they called it. Here in the back country of the Carolinas, they called it a great spiritual awakening. They had itinerant preachers, circuit preachers, who would come around, and they would preach mostly fire and brimstone in the pulpits. And they would get people all riled up. And the established clergy of the day was not too pleased with these folks coming around. They felt that they were actually abusing religion by intimidating people with fear. And I think that's very important to understand, that fear is a very basic emotion. It's common to all people. And we can easily be manipulated by our fears. We see politicians do it all the time. We see anybody who pretty much wants to get our control will do it. There's always something that we need to be afraid of, and if we give them the power that they want, give them our money, give them our support or whatever, they will protect us. They will protect us from whatever that is that we're supposed to be afraid of, even if they created the very thing that we're supposed to be afraid of, even if it's not real other than in their propaganda. But it works. It works. People do that. And you see people in the mid-1700s were being swayed to religion because if you didn't, you were going to go to hell and you were going to burn forever. Superstition. And Ernest Holmes says, let's drop that superstition. Let's forget about superstition. The God that created us is a God of love. The God that created us cannot send us to suffer in hell for eternity because it would be there with us, right? Because we are part of it. So let's drop the fear. Let's drop the superstition. And let's approach this subject of life as we would any other science. Let's inquire, let's test, let's see what it's all about. Very lovingly, very kindly. So Dr. Hornaday kind of tells one story, I think, that illustrates how Ernest approached life. The two of them, Dr. Hornaday and Dr. Holmes, were going into a lunch counter in a drugstore in Los Angeles. And there was a homeless man standing outside the store begging for money, and the man was intoxicated. And everybody was walking by this homeless person, and they were trying to avoid him, trying to pretend that he wasn't there. And Ernest Holmes walked right up to him and introduced himself to the fellow. And he said to the man, he said, "Are you hungry?" And the guy said, "Yes." So Ernest says, "Well, would you like to be my guest for lunch? My friend Bill and I were just going to go in and get a sandwich, and you're welcome to join us, And Dr. Hornaday, of course, he had kind of a humorous way to present. He's making all kinds of faces like, what in the world is Ernest doing? They went right into the drugstore, and they went and they sat at the lunch counter, and people are kind of giving them funny looks, and Ernest apparently didn't see the looks or didn't pay any attention to the looks. And he's talking to the man and asked the man, what he did and the gentleman said that, well, he used to be a sign painter, an artist. He did signs, and he's kind of down on his luck and didn't have much business and those sorts of things. And they order lunch, and Dr. Hornaday says as they're eating their lunch, this fellow is getting more and more sober. He's getting more and more lucid. He's not acting as drunk as he was when they first met him. He's straightening up in his appearance. And while they're sitting there, the manager of the store comes over to the person running the lunch counter, and he points up at a piece of poster board that was up on the wall that had the menu up there, and the manager says, "That's pretty old and faded. We need to get a new one made." So Dr. Holmes turns to this homeless man and he says, "Well, you're a sign painter. You could do that, couldn't you?" And the guy said, "Sure." So Ernest said, "Well, sit here for a minute." So Ernest runs through the drugstore and he comes back with poster boards and marker pens. And while they're sitting there at the lunch counter, this fellow makes a new menu on poster board for the store. And Ernest says, "Well, let's go see the manager." And he takes the fellow over to the manager and he says to the manager, "Is this the kind of thing that you had in mind?" And the manager said, "Yes." And Ernest says to the homeless man, he says, "What would you charge for such a thing?" And the man told him, and the manager and the man negotiated a price, and he got paid. He got paid for doing this sign. And when they left, Ernest took the man and put him in the car. And Dr. Hornaday did the driving, and he told Dr. Hornaday where to go, and they took him over to a vacant building that Ernest knew of a few blocks away. And Ernest said to the fellow, he says, "Would that make a suitable sign shop? Do you think you could set up a sign business in there?" And the guy said, "Yes, I could." And Ernest said, "Well, I'll tell you what I'm going to do." He says, "Now this is a loan. He says, "This is not a handout. This is a loan because I know that you have the ability to make that business work and to pay me back. Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to secure that building. I'm going to get the lease on the building. We'll get you your supplies, and we'll get you your first for your first month. After that, you're on your own, and then you have to pay me back." And he did. Ernest did. And the man made it. He sobered up. He went back into business. He made a successful sign business. And Dr. Hornaday said he told the story for two reasons. One is to show that Ernest was never bothered by the appearances. Everybody else was shying away from that man because he was dirty and he was drunk. And Ernest saw the potential. He saw the spiritual being. He would not give in to the prejudices of society, but he kept his mind focused on the good that he knew that he was there. And the second thing is that Ernest had a simple simplicity. He believed that no matter what was going on, that the power of affirmative prayer, the power of treatment, would change the conditions. And that's the way he led his life. And if you read the biographies of him, if you listen to the people who knew him and talked to him, that's just the way he led his life. We live in a spiritual universe. It responds to us according to our belief. We know we have the technique to change whatever circumstances we feel we want to have changed in our lives. But we have to use it. You see, we have to use it. There are some things that the divine won't do for us or can't do for us. And it can't do for us what it created us to do for ourselves, which is to decide. We must decide and we must use the power that we have been given. So this is why when we get to the 4th chapter of the introduction, Ernest starts right off and he says, "The great danger with the new order of thought is that there will be too much theory and too little application." People will talk about it, they will talk all around it, they will study it, they will go to classes, they will read books, they will do all kinds of things. But will they use it? But will they use it? And I think it's very interesting because that first chapter of the textbook was written before 1926, and when Dr. Holmes gave his last talk at the Asilomar Conference Center, it's documented in a little booklet called Sermon by the Sea, which I think is available in PDF form online. But Ernest, after some 30 years, Ernest was standing there addressing the crowd, and he said, "What would it be like if we could get 1,000 people to use this power that we're talking about?" And he was speaking to 1,000 people. That's what strikes me about it. He was speaking to 1,000 people. He was speaking after 30 years of teaching. What would it be like if we could get 1,000 people together to use this power? And I think he was saying the same thing then that he was saying in the introduction to the textbook. There's a great danger that we will talk too much about it and we won't use it. William James, who's referred to as the father of American psychology, gave a series of a series of lectures in Edinburgh, Scotland, in 1898. Excuse me. And they're called The Varieties of Religious Experience. And what James did was he just kind of looked at different religious orientations or different religious worldviews, and he said, what does it look like in terms of experience? Right? And I think that's another key observation. If you go and you try to study world religions in college courses and just in books, for example, go get a book about Egyptians. Go get a book about the religion of ancient Egypt. And what they do is they give you a catalog of the names of the different gods. Well, Ra was the sun god, then you had Isis, and then you had Osiris, and then you had Horus. And they kind of give you a list of the names of the important deities in the religion. But that doesn't tell you what it was like, what the experience of growing up in that religion was like, I give it the equivalent. I grew up in the Catholic Church, and we had a catechism of saints, and it would tell you for every day of the year was typically the feast day of some particular saint. And it would tell you the name of the saint, and they would tell you a little bit of biographical history and why they were canonized, why they became a saint. Well, you can't pick up that book and read the names of all the different saints and understand what it's like to grow up Catholic. It's that is not what growing up Catholic is like. That is just one of the books that the Catholics used. So much of our intellectual pursuit of other religions doesn't get to what the experience is like, but tells us some kind of factoids about it. And William James said, well, what is it like? What is the experience like? What are the varieties of religious experience? And he noted something that I thought was very interesting. First of all, he broke religions up into two worldviews. He called them the healthy-minded optimists and the sick-minded pessimists, which was not very objective, I don't think. But if you think of what I was talking about, fire and brimstone and those kinds of things, that would have been where the sick-minded pessimists kind of fell in. The healthy-minded optimists kind of fell into Ralph Waldo Trine and Warren Felt Evans and P.P. Quimby and kind of people that William James's parents studied with. And James talked about the conversion experience. And he said that either way, if people believe themselves to be a terrible sinner, condemned to hell and not worthy of being loved, and all of a sudden one day they have the big, I've been saved experience, the conversion experience. And on the other side of it, you have people who never quite felt that way, that they were terrible and all of that, but they have also a conversion experience, so they one day wake up and they say, the very presence of the divine created me out of itself. And all that the Father has is mine, and these kind of things, and they start to feel themselves to be a part of this bigger picture. And he said that was kind of the conversion experience for the healthy-minded optimists. And he said if you look at the two groups after that, and you ask what has changed in their lives, what you will find is nothing. Nothing has changed, other than that they feel better about themselves. But if you look at their behavior, if you look at the experience of their life, nothing changes. I thought that was very interesting. Now, this is not everyone, but this is the vast majority of the converts, if you will. This is the vast majority of the people who have the aha experience. You see, I think there is something in human nature that wants to feel good, that wants to talk about things, that wants to sing about things, that wants to shout about things, that wants to read about things and listen to talks about things. But when it comes to actually doing it and applying it, there's a reluctance, there's a hesitance, there's a resistance. And this is what Ernest was cautioning us about. We have to show what we know. We have to test our own ability to use our theory. We have to move from the laboratory of theoretical knowledge, right, into the laboratory of practical application. Edison is remembered as a great scientist, but Edison was more interested in practical applications of scientific discoveries than he was in discovering new things itself. In other words, he looked at something and said, how can we make money with that? What kind of a product can we make out of that? Other people before Edison were working on light bulbs. Edison knew if he could perfect the light bulb, he could have something he could sell, power generating plants, copper wire, all those things. So he went to work on perfecting the light bulb. So where others had gone before him and filed patents and failed, he continued on, he persevered until he broke through. If Edison didn't see the practical value in something, he didn't pursue it. You know, he invented the first motion picture machines, which you kind of looked in and there was a handle on it. You turned the handle and there was a little, like a Rolodex of still pictures in there that flipped over one at a time. And they flipped over so quickly that they looked like they were moving. And one of his associates said, you know, if we could find a way to project that image onto the wall, why, we could get a whole bunch of people together to watch the motion picture at the same time. And you know, we could make more money because right now people are paying a nickel, put the nickel in and turn the handle. And Edison said, you know, you're never going to get a bunch of strangers to go sit together in the dark to watch a movie. I'm not going to pursue that. So Edison was extremely biased on the practical application. If he couldn't see a practical application, he didn't bother. Other scientists are focused on the theoretical discovery. When I was associated with Bell Northern Research, which was Bell Labs of Canada, we had a base research team. They just played in the lab. They got paid to play in the lab to discover new and different things, without having to be fettered with wondering, well, how are we going to sell that? How are we going to make money on it? Other people came along and afterwards and reviewed what they had discovered and said, oh, we can use that, we can turn it into a product by doing this by it. So we had the two different camps. We had the theoretical and then we had the applications teams. What Ernest is telling us is we have to be both. In our own lives, we have to be both. You see, we will never know if we really know what we're talking about unless we can use it. We only know as much as we can do. So we can sit around and we can talk about there's a power in the universe that responds to me exactly according to my belief. We can talk about that all day. We can read about that all day. We can write songs about it and sing songs about it all day. But until we actually sit down and use it, we won't know if it's true. Or we won't know if it's true, but we don't know how to use it. And if we don't know how to use it, it's of no value to us. Edison didn't know how to use a movie projector. It was of no value to him. So we have to test ourselves from time to time. And it's the example I use is learning how to play a musical instrument. Excuse me, you study musical theory, you learn how to read notes on paper, you learn how to associate those notes with some particular key position on the instrument, or holding a string in a certain position, or somehow recreating that sound on that instrument. But you have to actually play the instrument. You have to pick up the instrument or sit down at the instrument, and you actually have to do it, or you will simply know about it. And each step that you go through, you're building knowledge to go to the next step. So you sit down and you learn how to play individual notes. You learn the names of the notes, for example, on a piano. And then at some point you learn a scale, a musical scale. And you learn the relation of the sounds within the scale to one another. Some are a half step apart, some are a whole step apart, those kind of things. And then you start to study how chords are made up, and chords are just a couple of notes on the scale that are played at the same time. And you learn how to progress through the scale. You learn what note goes with the first position of the scale and the fourth position of the scale, and so on. And my point is that each step builds on the one previous, and if you don't do your practice, if you don't practice the one previous, you can't advance. You get to a point where you keep failing. You backslide. You can't play anymore. You've got too many bad habits. You haven't done your homework. You don't really know what to do. And I met a man one time who was from India, a musician, had come to this country to do a series of concerts. And I was introduced to him. Some folks in our community were holding a dinner to welcome him. And I was invited, and when I was introduced to him, I was introduced as pastor of one of the local churches. And this fellow didn't hold American churches, American religion in high regard. So he, excuse me, I think he wanted to take a few digs at me to see if, to see how I would react. And he said, Americans. He said, yeah. He says, they're the people that like to go to church 11 o'clock on Sunday morning and hold hands and sway and listen to flowery words and feel all good about themselves and then go home the rest of the week and do nothing about it. He said, when I was a boy learning how to play my instrument, he says, I went to see my master. My master would give me a lesson, and then he would give me practice to go home and practice. He says, if I went home and didn't pick up that instrument for a week and then went back for a lesson, he would throw me out of his house. He would know immediately that I hadn't done my homework. He said, how do you expect to learn more if you haven't even tried to use what I gave you last week? He says, that's the way Americans are about religion. He says, they want to go back week after week and get the same lesson over and over in a different way, but they never want to practice. So I assured him that ours was a practical teaching, and I understood what he was talking about, but that was not our intention at all. And this is what Ernest is telling us. You have to take what you are learning and you have to put it to use, so that not only will you be able to understand how well you understand it, right? Because you can't use it if you don't understand it. It works with you according to your understanding, so you have to test your understanding to make sure that you truly understand it. And then you have to build a base or a step so that you can master that step before you move on to the next. Right? So we're constantly growing in our depth. We're constantly growing in our understanding. We do our treatment. We get our feedback. We see what works. We see what doesn't work. We ask questions. Maybe we go back to a minister or a practitioner with a question and say, tell me a little bit about this or tell me a little bit about that. But in this way, we are constantly getting better and better and better at what we're doing. Excuse me. And it is a skill. It is a skill like any other skill. You have to keep practicing it or you lose it. If you only drove a car once every 10 years, you'd probably be a little bit rusty when you got behind the wheel. If you want to fly an airplane, you have to maintain currency. You have to be able to demonstrate that you've flown a certain amount of hours every month, or you have to go back and you have to fly with a flight instructor to take a check ride. And if you're not capable of flying by yourself, they make you take a couple lessons with them before they'll sign off your logbook, which kind of frees you to go back into the air. So we want to consider then that what we're learning is both an art and a skill, a science, and that we have to apply what we know in order to demonstrate that we know it, in order to see what we learn from doing it. Right? You learn by doing. So you get your theory, you apply your theory, you analyze it, and you go back through the wheel of learning. So very simply, what Ernest is telling us is there's a power in the universe that responds to us according to our belief. What we want to do is we want to be aware of what we believe. We want to be aware of the circumstances in our lives. We want to be aware of those circumstances that we would like to see changed. We want to recognize that there's a power that is ready, willing, and able to work with us to produce that change. But it can only produce that change as our consciousness changes. And the good news is that power works with us to change our consciousness. It knows how to do whatever needs to be done in order to make the demonstration. Now, one of the things that we have to remember is that we are so trained in our society, we are so trained to take our minds to what is not working and to dwell on it, that we tend to go back and do that, and therefore we create more of what's not working. So there's a law, Emmett Fox calls it the law of substitution. What we have to do is recognize when a negative thought comes into our mind, and we have to substitute it with the positive thought. So if we're going through an experience of lack in our lives, if we're going through a time when there's not enough money to pay the bills, it's easy for us to focus on what's wrong. And what we have to do is bring ourselves back to remind ourselves, in God's universe, there's enough and plenty. Everything that we see is the invisible stuff of the unlimited universe taking whatever form, and supply as is appropriate at this time. That God is my source, God is my substance, God is my supply. My income is not limited or dependent upon any person, place, or thing, but only dependent upon my realization of God. Okay? So what we're doing is we are bringing our mind away from the problem, and we are bringing our mind to God. Okay? Take your mind off the problem, put your mind on God. So what we do is we very deliberately decide what it is that we shall have. We remind ourselves at the very first step that God already is that, God already has that, God is the source of that. We then remind ourselves that the divine has created us out of itself in its image and likeness. And because the divine already has whatever it is that we are developing the consciousness of, then in truth we must have it as well. So we declare at that point that we are not only willing, but we are releasing and letting go of every and anything in our consciousness that does not agree with the truth, and that the activity of the law is now helping us to accept the demonstration of that which we are declaring. We express our gratitude, and this is a very important step, because in the step where we accept, we want to bring ourselves to a feeling that it is already done, a feeling that it is already accomplished. Bill Hornaday said when Dr. Holmes would treat, he would sit, he would close his eyes, he would put his head down, he would be silent for a while, and then he would raise his head and he'd say, "Wow, that was good. That was good." We want to do our treatment till we get the feeling that it's done. It's already done. It's done. I don't have to do anymore. I couldn't do anymore. It's done. So the gratitude that we express is the gratitude that it is already done. It's not the gratitude that it's going to happen. It's not the gratitude that I hope it will happen. It is done. It is done. Somebody walks up to you and hands you $1,000 in cash. It's done. It's different from them calling you on the phone and saying, someday when I get around to it, I'm going to send you a check for $1,000. You have the money in your hand. It's done. It's that kind of feeling of completeness, this gratitude of completeness. And then the last step is we have to let it go. We have to recognize that there is a power in the universe that responds to us exactly according to our belief. And it has now taken this treatment, taken this affirmative prayer, and it does the rest. And it's like being at the top of a hill and you got a little snowball and you push it down the hill. And gravity takes over and does the rest. You're done. Excuse me. You're done. The result will be at the bottom of the hill. But your part is over. You got the ball moving. So we practice that. We find things in our lives that we would like to change, and we practice that. And Dr. Holmes spells out in this chapter, he says, how long do we treat? How often do we treat? And he says, you treat every day until the demonstration is made. You treat every day. Now, you never want to go in and say, well, this issue is going to take a long time. Right? That's self-defeating, because if you believe that, it will take that. Every day that you treat, you want to bring yourself to a complete acceptance at that point in time that it is done, and release it. And if tomorrow it's not, you don't see the demonstration yet, you treat again, and you make every treatment as complete as you can. We must recognize that it doesn't take the truth time to demonstrate, but there's an unfoldment. Perhaps in our consciousness there's an unfoldment, or in the circumstances about us there might be an unfoldment. Louise Hay gives an example of when she moved to California from New York. She knew exactly what kind of apartment she wanted, and she treated that she now had that apartment. And it just wasn't showing up for her. She couldn't understand why. And one day she was walking down a street and she saw a sign for these apartments that were going to soon be leasing. And she looked at the floor plan, and it was everything that she had wanted. And she realized that they started building that building the same time that she did her first treatment. There was a process of unfoldment that took place in her life. And she said if she hadn't been so specific about what she wanted, where she wanted in those things, that it may have occurred for her sooner in some other location. So we never want to consider that anything is going to take a long time. But we never want to get discouraged if it doesn't appear right away. It is right now unfolding perfectly. It is right now working perfectly. And the power is immutable. It is inevitable. Excuse me again. And Emmett Fox tells us that what we do is we treat the treatment. If we do our treatment and the next day we don't have the result yet, we treat ourselves to remember that the first treatment that we gave is operating perfectly. It is just fine. So as we do this, what happens, is as we do this, we get better at it. We get the feedback that we need to get better at it. We start to learn how we feel. We start to learn how we think. We start to observe what's going on in the world around us and the world within us. And as we start to get better at this, it shows us that yes, in fact, there is a power in the universe that responds to us according to belief. We live in a spiritual universe. It demonstrates that for us. Sometimes Ernest calls it demonstrating the power of spiritual thought force. But we live in a universe that responds to us according to our belief. Of course, that makes it easier for us to deepen our belief in that. And then after a while, what happens is we start to move to another level. So Ernest tells us that at the beginning, we have things in our lives that we want to change. And that's good, and that's normal, and that's natural, and we do that. But after a while, we start to say, but who am I? Who am I that this power of the universe responds to me? What am I that this power of the universe responds to me? And we realize that with all of our treatment, that the only way that we get a demonstration is, he calls it, to get God. We must have a deeper realization of the immediate presence of the divine in our lives. So as we start to experience to a deeper degree the presence and the activity of the divine in our lives, we now take it up a step. We now go up to the next level. And we want to know more about the presence of the divine in our lives. And we want to experience more about the presence of the divine in our lives. And not for any particular purpose. Now we still use the law consciously. We still cooperate. And we don't have any choice, by the way, of whether or not it's going to respond to us. Keep that in mind. It's always responding to us, whether we're aware of it or not. So the sane thing to do is to use it deliberately, consciously. But at some point, we, as Ernest puts it, we just want to be at home with the beloved. And we start to enter the mystical. We just want to feel the love of God. We just want to be with the love of God. We just want to feel ourselves wrapped in the arms of divine love. So what happens is that process then of using what we know, of applying what we know, of changing our minds and seeing the resulting changes in our lives, it leads us to a deeper desire to know God. It leads us to a deeper desire to simply be at home with the beloved. As we move to that level of consciousness, any ideas that we had that were unlike the ideas of the divine, any ideas of lack or limitation or of anger or of fear, they naturally dissolve. As we go closer to the light, the darkness fades. So what we can see then is that you and I are on a spiritual journey. We are part of the unfoldment of the soul, the soul of the entire race, the soul of the individual. That what the destiny of the soul is to discover its relationship with the divine and to desire to know it more fully, to know it not just intellectually, but to know it experientially more fully. But we have to start where we are. We have to start where we are. And we have the knowledge, and we have at our disposal a technique of spiritual mind treatment, affirmative prayer, if you prefer to call it that, a technique that helps us to change our consciousness so that this unlimited, immutable power of the universe that responds to us according to our belief has a greater opening, a different opening to flow through us and to bring into visible demonstration in our lives the activity of God. So let's use what we know. Let's make ourselves a promise, if you will, that we'll take one thing in our lives that we want to work with. And we'll work with it until it's changed. And then we'll take another and we'll work with that until it's changed. And we will keep our minds changed 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We will do our treatment in the morning or the evening, whichever is best for us. But during the day, we will be the shepherds watching the flock. We will be watching our thoughts. And if our thoughts stray off and start to dwell on the negative, we will gently herd them back and say, that's old consciousness. And cancel that and replace it. That is old consciousness. The new consciousness is that God is all there is, and God is good. Can you imagine what life is like? Can you imagine what life will be like? if everyone would do this. I think that's what Ernest was saying at the Sermon by the Sea. So it's easy for us to look to our neighbor and see the splinter in their eye and say, yeah, can you imagine how great life would be if that person over there just shaped up? But we have to start with ourselves. So Gandhi said, let's be the change that we wish to see in the world. Let's make this the year together that we truly accept ourselves as spiritual beings, that we truly dedicate ourselves to applying what we know so we can see how well we know it, and we can build that platform to go up the next notch, and then the next notch, and then the next notch. And let's see how amazed we can be when we get together a year from now and review these 4 chapters again to see what new, different message they have for us. Raymond Charles Barker said, life is a process of the now becoming the future through our present thoughts. We can create whatever future we want if we will simply apply that which we already know. It's already here. It's already now. Let's do it. And so it is.